That sounds good. Thanks, everybody, and welcome to, I was trying to think of this yesterday. I believe this is OMUG meeting number 4 in COVID. Carol, correct me if I'm wrong here, but yeah, it's been a year for sure. This format has actually worked out okay. We've seen our attendance go up quite a bit. In the Zoom world, the two-dimensional Zoom world, I guess. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kyle Hauger. I'm one of 3 chairs for the Oregon Modeling Users Group. And if this is your first meeting, welcome. And let me just say that we are an informal group that gets together that focuses on analytical topics related to planning and forecasting. We like to kind of test the policies that are given to us, and we do that using various software platforms and various analytics. And it's the purpose and intention of this group to really kind of share with like-minded folks how we've tested those policies and some of the outcomes and results. And today I'm really excited for the lineup that we have set for this OMUG meeting. In particular, it's kind of a transportation economics focus. We've got a couple of speakers from Metro here locally in Portland, and we have one from the Bay Area as well. So three speakers are set to go today. And here in a minute, we will get going. I think what we'll do is Jeff Raker will lead us off today. And I'll have each speaker kind of introduce themselves to the group. There's not enough time to really go around and do a roundtable for everyone that's shown up today, but we're getting good numbers. I see about 25 people on the line, so that's a pretty strong meeting for us. But if I could have each speaker kind of introduce themselves, maybe tell us where you work, what your focus is, and that'll get the stage set. Logistically, in terms of the meeting, I think it's going to work best if we don't ask necessarily questions aloud during the presentation, but you can certainly use the chat room for that. Myself as the moderator, I'll kind of monitor the chat room, I guess, and make sure that all questions do get addressed. And let's see, we will be recording this session, so you can go back to the OMUG website, which we'll provide a link to, and review this meeting or pass it along to others. Did I leave anything out, Carol?
I think we're good to go.
Okay. Jeff Raker with Metro. Please kick us off.
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm Jeff Raker. I'm the Senior Economic Development Planner with Metro, and I have been here since about 2015. I was hired essentially to be a liaison between what we do on transportation and land use investment and what others outside the building do on economic and workforce development activities. And what I'm presenting today is a body of work that we worked on with the Brookings Institution, and we continue to work with them in sort of improving it as an application, integrating it into kind of some other policy arenas within our agency, as well as exploring some applications for local jurisdictions and economic development and workforce development partners as well. So thought it might be useful to kind of go through for about a 10-minute presentation, as well as a 10-minute demo, and then give you some sort of opportunity to have a back and forth on some of the elements of it. So can I share my screen, Kyle?
You absolutely can, Jeff. You
Okay.
can, if you just hit
There we go.
Yep, you got it.
All right. So the foundations of the project, so essentially there's a recognition that, planners have a good sense of how to kind of, a relatively good sense of how to align transportation and land use to advance sort of community development and placemaking objectives, but less of a sense of how that interacts with business investment, how it interacts with workforce development needs, and there's a desire to facilitate a better alignment with what economic development practitioners and workforce development practitioners and what planners do. So that was sort of the motivation behind a lot of this project. For obviously helping communities be more intentional about how and where investments are made when we're making transportation decisions and other decisions. And trying to get a sense of the kind of economic landscape and of different areas and the different competitive advantages that particular areas of our region have. And then being transparent and have the tool I'll present is fully available online, and giving some sense of the transparent use of data and sort of the challenge there is obviously communicating how robust or lacking robustness that this might have, but to be sure it's facilitating both as a service to outside organizations as well as sort of an information exchange. So originally we had a lot of economic development practitioners, workforce development practitioners, the ports, Brookings and PSU, the state, some state reps, county reps, cities, and some in the private sector were represented on both a sort of higher level task force as well as a technical team that supported the work. We based our framing on existing economic development plans. So at the time, there was a comprehensive economic development strategy, which has now gone through an update and is about to be released for a 30-day comment period that I was sort of co-leading with our economic development district partners. And the framing is still relatively the same in terms of these three pillars of kind of more traditional economic development and business focused on sort of how are we growing jobs, what type, are we bringing in traded sector companies, are we improving market access, is there good labor access, from a more people perspective, and that's more on eliminating hurdles to people of color, women and marginalized communities, addressing sort of inclusive economic development considerations. And then place, are we leveraging the assets we have? Is there land available to develop? What does the market look like? What are the mobility factors that are sort of underlying all of this? So that framing has informed the tool. And then it was important for us to kind of be able to map out key industries that were also prioritized by economic development practitioners. So there's a focus on clean tech, computers and electronics, software and media, sporting equipment, apparel and design, health science and tech, and metals and machinery. And then the lower right two graphics represent local service. So that's like your hospital, your local beauty salon, your bars and whatnot, and then tradable services and tradable goods, and getting a sense of those industries that are able to sell a service or a product outside of the region. So getting a sense of where those different types of businesses are concentrated was a priority and is integrated into the tool itself. And then we wanted it to be sort of a decision support tool. I think we're still getting there in terms of like adapting it for actual decision making on infrastructure. Just actually before this meeting, had a conversation about how the tool can be used or adapted for use in our regional flexible fund allocation. And I think in this cycle or the next, we'll be introducing a lot of interesting applications of this tool and sort of evaluating the set of projects that are submitted to our allocation processes for federal money. So I think it does have some legs in terms of informing that process. But to get there, obviously, we wanted to be able to characterize kind of different stories out of this. Is it growing jobs? Is it is the geography that we're focusing on relative to other geographies in the region. How is it sort of, what's its condition when it comes to these factors in business people in place? And then there's this business location component, which is, I'll go into it in the demo, but essentially just getting at what are certain factors that different businesses might be interested in, and then therefore where are the most ripe locations for their business expansion efforts, and maybe connections to the workforce they want to be connected to, et cetera. This same platform, though, was then applied regionally, but really based on the principles that were established as part of an equitable development strategy for the Southwest Corridor light rail line between Portland, Tigard, and Tualatin. And so we established a set of shared principles. There's a lot of depth to that project in terms of the engagement we did for community-based organizations, and now they're actually leading their own initiative called the Southwest Equity Coalition that is standing not within Metro's control, but within a collective impact model led by a few different organizations centered on advancing racial equity. And then we're more outer circle. So we facilitated sort of a startup and then a transformation of it into more of a community representative equity coalition. But in any case, those principles were used, and then Echo Northwest and a few of subs from around different parts of the country that are focused on gentrification or focused on sort of access to opportunity factors, et cetera, informed what we could put into the tool itself. And they had kind of their Echo Northwest version of it, which was available, but we just simply adapted the weighting and the data that went into that within our own platform as part of the Economic Value Atlas. So that is now fully integrated at this website. It's the equitytool.oregonmetro.gov. And that is a representative of more equity-focused conditions. So for example, changing communities or gentrification is one of the factors. And essentially it's saying, where are those areas that have rising income and sales price for housing, but we're losing renters and we're losing people of color, for instance, and you can kind of start to get at the Northeast Portland impact that has been felt when it comes to the gentrification issue. And so there's other factors like that. There's definitely some need to improve some of the metrics that are in this, particularly on health. Right now, it's more focused on walkability and just percentage of health insurance. And I think there's other factors that we'd like to fold in eventually, say like on BMI or obesity or other CDC factors, exposure to hazardous air, et cetera, that might be important in integrated into the tool. So where does this go? Obviously, we're going to continue, and we are actively continuing to kind of innovate on the software. I think we'll embrace a full update either late this year or into the next year. It's helping get integrated into policy considerations, and then overall just informing conversations like what we just had when it comes to the comprehensive economic development strategy. It's been informative in kind of crafting that strategy and some of the initiatives that we would advance as part of that. So specific applications are, as I mentioned, this regional flexible fund allocation where we distribute certain federal monies to transportation projects in agreement with the policies from the RTP. It was informative in the, unfortunately, the Get Moving 2020 measure that failed, but it helped us really articulate some of the economic and equity conditions, in particular corridors that were being invested in as part of the proposed package. And it is definitely serving as kind of the foundation for the next regional transportation plan. On the land use and growth management side, we're entering into a very early stage concept about evaluation or a reevaluation of sort of economic activity on our lands and how that influences our policies when it comes to employment and industrial land and other employment centers and sort of the land use policy we use, as well as providing contextual information more locally to inform the development of specific sites. And so there was a site readiness toolkit that we established, and there were a set of roadmaps we did with 3 jurisdictions alongside the consultant that was diving into other issues to kind of get at what are the economic conditions and equity conditions surrounding this site, and how might your site development be informed by that. And then on economic development, clearly involvement in the comprehensive economic development strategy and needs to be updated to reflect some of the updates in that. It supports a bi-state conversation. The Columbia Connect strategy that's starting to ramp up was kind of during the recovery planning period for the economic recovery plan. I was kind of pulled away from some of my other duties. So now we're re-entering that process. And then setting context for city and county level strategies. So there's a lot of economic opportunity analyses that are done on a local jurisdictional basis, as well as their own distinct sort of Main Street and other types of economic development strategy development. And the tool has been used and is informative for some of these. I can go into this when I demo, but connection to opportunity zones and other planning geographies that have sort of economic development relevance. And of course, the economic recovery plan discussion, sort of some of the metrics that were used in this were also adapted for conversations about how we establish where we are in economic recovery for the region. And then we are doing a lot to kind of understand disruptive or significant trends in the economy that might be influential. Automation, e-commerce, and its advance, particularly its acceleration during this COVID period, as well as other types of more trend line and factors like climate and other things like this that influence the economy, or the economy influences as well. And so evaluating those types of disruptions and trends and trying to integrate that into our land use and transportation investment considerations. So with that, I'll switch over to the demo. So here's the tool itself. This is the metro region around Portland. You'll see the Columbia River here, downtown Portland. So I'm just gonna pretend I'm a particular type of business that's interested in particular factors. So labor access, I am interested in understanding where there's a good pool of entry-level labor. So this is workers without a BA within a 30-minute commute of each individual census tract. That same industry might be interested in the developability when it comes to buildable commercial and industrial land, as well as the existing square footage. So you start to see that the Columbia Corridor shows up. Obviously, there are larger census geographies, so there's going to be some element of that. But there is a strong presence of logistics companies, for instance, and Gresham Vista, Central East Side are showing up. Some of the geographies that are of importance to those types of companies. A different type of business might be interested in high skill labor that are in an area that still has a good base of industrial and commercial square footage. And guess what? They want to poach from other like industries, so software and media jobs, for instance. So you start to see where a software and media company might want to locate potentially, and you see the Emerald Crescent kind of show up. And so, obviously all of this is very imperfect in terms of like full representation, but it gives you a sense of some of where those businesses might be interested in locating. And then I can go into the people factors, but I'm going to use this separate equity tool to reflect some of the factors that went into this. So that there's a change in median household income. You can weight it. You can look at the individual tract for sort of where they land relative to the average tract in the region. Actually, I take that back. This is TAZ for the equity tool. And so it gets at kind of where is this my neighborhood when it comes to the level of gentrification that's occurred in this selected TAZ relative to the average in the region. And so we're using this tool to kind of elevate different conditions in amongst all of the different factors. You can kind of look at it from a bar chart standpoint to compare between tracts, for instance, and look at it slightly differently, using a spider graph, et cetera. And then the other thing we're doing is, I mentioned, sorry, wrong, one moment, my apologies. We meant, we have mapped the projects in our regional transportation plan, and there's a level of project detail that this has, like cost, how it aligns with certain benefits that are included in that evaluation, time period, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sort of a mapping of that. And now we're trying to figure out, okay, can that be overlaid on other factors that we're interested in looking at, and get the project descriptions incorporated into this. And that's how we may be evaluating transportation projects, for instance, for these economic and equity considerations on a local level. Yeah, so that's my sort of overall description of both the tool, its framing, and sort of possible applications and current applications. And I'm very much open to questions and thoughts around it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Cool analytics. I think this group in particular is really a huge fan of storytelling. The ability to do that with analytics and easy to use or easy to show charts and whatnot is certainly helpful. And really project independent. It's really cool to see visuals and graphics to whomever it may be, a council person or a developer, as you said, or frankly just an analyst too. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. I'll just read them, I guess, as they come in here, or as they're listed, from Alex. Alex's first question is I'll call it a classic modeler's question. Alex says that was an interesting 8 employment categories that you showed. Would you be willing to provide the NAICS code crosswalk to build those aggregate employment categories? So, Jeff, I'm sure you're familiar with the NAICS codes, and we use them and rely on them quite a bit in travel forecasting for our land use data. Are you familiar with those? And
yeah, so there's a couple of ways we sliced industry sort of target industry concentration, and the 8 you're referring to, I think, represents the full spectrum of evaluation. So Brookings had a set that they sort of broke down in terms of like goods producing, tradable services, and then local, that has a NAICS separation or NAICS definitions around that sort of general category. And then there is a breakdown for target industries based on essentially one thing being the comprehensive economic development strategy and some NAICS we selected with consultant support based on that strategy and sort of the focus that economic development partners have, as well as NAICS codes connected to work systems evaluation of, say, like construction and healthcare and other more pertinent industries to workforce and job training for low barrier employment, for instance. And yeah, so I think we can share all of those NAICS breakdowns note that some of those NAICS definitions have been updated recently, and this is something we may have to reflect as kind of a baseline and a update, because the definitions around the industry clusters were shifting a little bit, particularly for clean tech, which is a challenging one to get at, and sort of separations between bringing in food industry and some others that might be interesting for our regional focus. So it depends on what you're actually looking for in terms of that industry focus. I can go ahead, Kyle, and just go through the chat and try to respond if you'd like.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Open it up just real quick for Alex, if you wanted to elaborate any more. Was there anything that that Jeff mentioned there that that maybe you wanted to elaborate on, Alex?
No, I don't think so. Just you know, I'd say our categories are kind of like stale, maybe a little bit, and you know, I think it looked like a lot of thought got put into kind of where trends might be going. And so you know, like you were saying, kind of Metro might have a slightly different flavor of that than others, but just seeing the starting point for the thought that went into that would be really interesting.
Yeah, and there's full documentation of this on that Brookings has, actually, because they sold this to a set of peer regions, and so we're working with a number of peer region, not sold like cost, but like as an idea, and we're working with those peer regions, and so there's a lot of documentation when it comes to sort of methodology, et cetera, that went into this, and I'll share that link with everyone right now, just so you have it in your back pocket. What is the software platform? You know, I saw this question. I was like, I totally forgot, except that I know that the Esri, it is Esri based, but it's able to be kind of internal. We don't have to depend on Esri because it's our own. Maybe Kyle can help me. I forgot. So I'll have to get back to you on that, with my apologies. But I can certainly get some information on that relatively quickly and get back to you. Are there data sources that are not available in other parts of the state? I would say that the sophistication of some of the buildable lands inventorying has been informative in this. The modeling information that was incorporated could be a factor. So for instance, Kyle ran numbers on the sort of the OD pairings between a TAS representative of every tract to specific TASs we were interested in. So there, for like distribution centers, or for access to PDX cargo facilities, or certain transit access question marks. So there are some specific data points that are Metro Portland region specific, but it largely depends on you know, census and other sort of publicly available data that other jurisdictions could utilize. The question mark might be whether, you know, in a smaller community, using census tracts is good enough, and you'd have to adapt your sort of analysis unit and deal with the margins of error that are associated with that. And we are, you know, as I said, Brookings is trying to apply this in other peer regions, so we're learning a lot from that. We'll get back to you on more, or can interact with you on more in terms of what data might be more challenging to access or use in smaller jurisdictions or other jurisdictions that don't have certain types of data availability.
Sounds good, Jeff. Remind me what the out years you guys look at. Do you look at interim years? I'm assuming you're consistent with our use forecasts, you know, out to 2040, 2045. Do you look at interim years as well?
This is not forecast. Right now, it's a snapshot, and it's a snapshot with a little bit of a variance in dates, obviously, because, or year, based on certain data. So, for instance, the buildable lands data doesn't fully align with some other data, but for the most part, it's around a 2015 And the trend lines that are included, I believe, are between 2005 and 2015. Now, because I intend to have an update, I think we'll kind of move that that forward in a different way to bring the updates to it. And in terms of kind of the conversation around using it for forecasting, I think there's definitely some application of that. I think our first step in thinking about the tool's use in that capacity would be to take a look at how it backcasts first. So, if there's, what I would love to do is be able to look at how the yellow line, look at, say, the census tracts around the yellow line and a baseline before that investment was made, and then an investment, and then a sort of an assessment of after that investment being in place for a number of years, and kind of doing that comparison would be tremendous with all of these data points. Whether that's a possibility, I'm not entirely sure, but I would love to be able to sort of, obviously test the accuracy of what the tool would be used for in terms of prediction, but also, then be able to apply it for any forecast consideration.
Sorry.
No, the other point is just that as we then evaluate specific transportation projects, it would be important to know this is what we saw from different types of transportation investment. And these are sort of the economic and equity conditions that have resulted from that, and therefore extrapolate out, given somewhat similar conditions, what that might look like for future transportation investment.
Yeah, you've elaborated it well. I was just thinking simply, maybe a simple use case would be just looking at differences between, say, a base and a forecast land use by employment sector. For example, if you take, like the transportation, warehouse, utility sector, and look at employment growth in the future, you may be able, and potentially map that out, say by TAZ, you might be able to get some insight as to, where distribution centers maybe in the region potentially are located or grow. And I would think that would help inform any kind of, economic development or certainly freight routes that are significant to the region. And in addition to overlaying all the other layers within the tool itself in terms of equity and access and things like that. That's what I was thinking initially. I think that would be interesting use of the tool as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say most people in this room are kind of like a little bit of a duh. I can do that with GIS, and I think the power of this is kind of, well, one, it's connected back to a set of shared values that then the proxies, sort of collapse that information and make it sort of easily interpretable from a higher level, elected or decision maker perspective. As well as communicating with the public. It's still a little wonky, and we need to work on that storytelling component. But that's a strength. And then the fact that it's just online and available is actually, I think, another element of this, that it's, so for instance, I've interacted with a couple of local partners that are pursuing economic development administration grants, and they're able to justify their investment based on saying, look, this area is ripe for investment, and it's facing these historical marginalization and has a population that deserves attention and investment, and then sell that to the feds. And so similarly, I think we'll be doing that sort of consistently in supporting applicants in justifying their grant applications for philanthropic dollars, for federal and state money, and that kind of thing. So I think it has that application as well.
Yeah, those are all certainly questions we're being asked. to consider, and certainly if you can quantify it or at least tell a story around it, all the better, all the better information. Okay, I think in the interest of time and agenda here that Carol's popping up now, I think that's our cue to move on to congestion pricing study update. But I did want to say thank you very much, Jeff. I believe this is your first presenter or presentation at OMUG. Hopefully we'll see you again, maybe on the update to the EVA tool. But thanks so much for coming in and stopping by and letting us know the cool work that you're doing.
Thanks a lot, folks, and feel free to contact me. I don't know if I have my contact information, but I can drop it in the chat for you. I appreciate it.
All right, Matt and Alex, also from ODOT. You guys are next up in the queue here. These guys are going to tag team on a recent project that Metro has worked on in a very popular topic here as of late, at least to the Portland Metro region, and that is congestion pricing and looking at testing different policies of pricing. So not just road pricing, but some system management measures as well. So I'm looking forward to this presentation, but before these two kick it off, Matt and Alex, maybe I'll have you guys, maybe Matt, you could start first, just a brief introduction of the work you do for Metro.
Sure, thanks, Kyle. I'm Matt Bin. I'm transportation planner at Metro in the investment areas group. And years ago, I've been at Metro for I think like 22 or 23 years. Years ago, I used to work with Kyle and Peter and Aaron in the modeling group. So I have some background in modeling, but generally we work on corridor projects and usually transit projects. So this is a little bit new to me, but I often work as kind of the liaison between the whatever project we're working on and the modeling. Alex.
And I'm Alex Orshak, transportation planner with Metro, also in the investment areas group. Like Matt, I work on a lot of different transportation projects. I've been working on Southwest Corridor, Earthquake Ready Burnside Bridge, enhanced transit corridors, and most recently, interstate bridge replacement. So a variety of transportation projects around the region.
All right, thanks.
I think I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
That's all right, Kyle.
I was just going to interrupt here real quick. Okay, so it looks like according to the agenda here, you guys have about the next half hour or so, 35 minutes. Again, if you're just joining us, let's save questions for the end. Let these guys get through their presentation. And if questions do pop up along the way, feel free to use the chat box. All right, take it away, Alex and Matt.
All right, thank you. Let's get a presentation shared. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to get a brief update about the study. Matt's going to spend a lot of time reviewing the technical findings from the different pricing scenarios we've looked at. And then we'll talk a little bit about an expert review panel that was recently held to talk about the project and then go over schedule and next steps. So this is the goal of the congestion pricing study. Essentially, we're looking to see how congestion pricing could help meet the region's climate and congestion goals and also address safety and equity concerns. An important thing to note here is that this study is not recommending or implementing any pricing measures. We're just studying. So we're hoping that our findings will help inform future discussions on implementation of congestion pricing and on policy recommendations, including efforts currently underway at ODOT and PBOT related to congestion pricing. We'll also outline some next steps for the region for evaluation and further study. Again, we're working to measure our pricing strategies against the region's 4 priorities of equity, climate, safety, and congestion, as identified in the RTP. And the way we're going about that is we're looking at some key performance measures, including vehicle miles traveled, the percentage of people using different modes, accessibility to jobs for both transit and auto trips, vehicle delay, emissions, and cost, both at a regional level and per traveler. And we're looking at 4 different, what we're calling families of tools, different types of congestion pricing. One is a vehicle miles traveled fee, also known as a road user charge, where drivers pay a fee for every mile they travel. Cordon pricing, where a driver pays to enter an area such as downtown Portland, or sometimes to drive within that area. Roadway pricing, where drivers pay to drive on a particular road, bridge, or highway. An example of that is the ODOT tolling work that's going on right now. And parking pricing, where you change the price to park in certain areas. And we've tested 8 different scenarios, 2 from each family. This table is a summary of what we're testing. In terms of how we've structured the technical analysis, we're charging only within the MPA boundaries and using $2010. And we really wanted to compare the effects of different types of charges and the amount charged. So for the 2 VMT or road user charge scenarios, we first looked at increasing the cost of driving by 32%, or cost of travel 32% over the baseline scenario. And the second scenario, 63% over our base. And that comes out to an increase of 6.85 cents per mile and 13.2 cents per mile, respectively. For the 2 Cordon scenarios, I'll show some maps in a moment, but we assessed a $5.63 charge to enter the Cordon area. And we came to that number by looking at a range of other cities that have implemented or are looking at Cordon pricing and picking a number at the higher end of that price range. For the 2 parking scenarios, again, I'll show a map to illustrate where the parking is charged. But for the first one, we assumed parking rates from the 2018 RTP's 2040 financially constrained scenario. And the second one, we doubled those assumptions. And finally, for the roadway scenarios, that's a charge per mile driven on our freeways and highways. For the first one, we looked at using the same per mile charge as the higher VMT charge, but just on the highways. That's 13.2 cents per mile. And again, we doubled that for the second scenario, which was 26.4 cents per mile. So just to help you be more oriented geographically, for the VMT scenarios, again, only charging within the MPA boundaries, which are identified in gray on this map. These are the 2 Cordon scenario maps. On the left, you'll see the smaller Cordon boundary, which is downtown Portland, the South Waterfront, and portions of Northwest Portland. And on the right, you'll see that the boundary expands in the larger scenario to include the Lloyd District and the Central East Side on the other side of the river. The important thing to note for the Cordon scenarios is when we tested these, we did not assess a charge to any trips that remain on the freeways and highways traveling through the Cordon. So I-5, I-405, or the US 26 to Ross Island Bridge trips. Those are not charged. We really wanted to see what happened when we charged drivers to enter the local street network within the Cordon area. This map shows the parking scenarios. The lowest charges are in the darkest green, and the charges increase as you move to a lighter green into yellow, orange, and then red is the highest charge. And what you'll see with the legend on the bottom right is that the smallest charge that we looked at in the parking A scenario was 16 cents for long-term parking in those darkest green areas, all the way up to a high of $32.60 per trip for long-term parking in the red. One thing to note here is that again, we're only looking in the MPA boundaries. So the region, the RTP does assume increased pricing in Vancouver, but we did not increase the rates in Vancouver beyond what that assumption is in the base scenario. And finally, the roadway scenarios. This map shows all of our throughways, which are the freeways and limited access highways in the MPA boundaries in red. And those are the routes that we assess the per mile charge to in these scenarios. So with that description of the scenarios out of the way, I just want to provide a very high level summary of the scenario performance before Matt gets into some detailed findings. What we found was that all 4 of the different pricing types helped to address our climate and congestion priorities. And all 8 of the scenarios that we looked at reduced the drive alone rate, vehicle miles traveled, and emissions, while also increasing daily transit trips. We did find that the geographic distribution of the benefits and costs varies by scenario, and Matt will provide some maps that show examples of that, and that there's different trade-offs for implementing the different scenarios. So one more high-level slide before we dive into the details. This table shows you how each scenario performed for each metric that we tested. And just when you're looking at this, green is good. It means better alignment with the regional goals compared to our base scenario. Darker green is better. And then the pinkish orange is less alignment with our regional goals, so it's not as good. And the darker the color is, again, the worse it performed. The gray ones are a minimal change in either direction. And what you see when you look at this table, just looking at a high level, the VMT and parking scenarios at a regional level really had good results for all of the metrics that we tested. In some cases, had very good results without any big red flags at a regional level, at least, for performance on these different metrics. It's a little bit different when you look at the cordon and roadway scenarios. That's not to say that we are saying that these are bad scenarios or that they shouldn't move forward, but we're identifying potential areas for further analysis, particularly vehicle hours of delay and job access. And it's important to note again, these results are before any sort of discounts or exemptions, any reinvestment of revenues or iterations of program design. So this is just testing one single scenario, not making any modifications based on what we found. An actual project moving forward would want to take these results, see where the impacts are, and see if they could make tweaks to the program, such as the area charged, time of day, stuff like that, to see if they can reduce or minimize those impacts. So that's everything at a high level. I think now Matt's going to dive in and talk about some of the specific results that we were seeing. Matt?
You'd think I'd learn by now. First, we're going to go over the volume change maps for the scenarios pretty quickly. Not every one, but an example from each. For VMT, where every trip is tolled, not surprisingly, you see a drop in volumes on just about every roadway in the region. Next. Oh, I should mention too, in the model, people can change their destination as a response to whatever tolling we have. People can change their destination, they can change their mode, they can change their route. What they can't do in our model is change the time of day of their trip, and they can't choose not to make the trip at all. So that's kind of an important background. So VMT, basically every trip is tolled, so you see reductions on just about every facility. Next. The cordons are a little more interesting. You see a drop in volumes inside the cordon, as you'd expect, because those are the only, as trips are told to enter into the cordon. But you see some diversion outside of the cordon area. The roadways that sort of point directly to the cordon and bring traffic to the cordon see reductions. But you can see the freeways like I-5 and I-405, especially in some of the arterials that are adjacent to the cordon, have higher volumes. And you will see some of the impacts of that later on. Next. On the parking map, volumes decrease downtown and then streets, again, that are kind of directing traffic towards downtown and in some of the other employment areas. You can see some around Beaverton, Washington Square, but a large portion of the region is pretty much not affected. Next, we're going to look at both roadways. So this is, again, tolling the freeways and highways. And as you'd expect, you see the volumes decrease on those freeways, but you see them increase on the arterials. The next one is roadway B, where we ramp up the cost, and you can see that happening more so. So that's nothing shocking there, but that kind of feeds into the next slides when we look at some of the results. And in our report, we have a slew of different results, but we'll just go over a few of them here. So the first one's VMT. The VMT drops the VMT scenarios in the roadway, as we saw from the maps, had the biggest changes in volumes, and that's where we see the largest change in VMT, but all of them show a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. VMTC and roadway B are greater than 5% reductions in VMT, so pretty large changes. And also when we compare these, how much is a 1% change or a 5% change, The regional transportation plan, the constrained network shows about a 1.6% decrease in VMT compared to the no build. So these are, these would be in addition to that. And so we think these are pretty, significant changes, especially when you're talking about those the VMT numbers. I mean, sorry, the VMT scenario numbers. Next, the drive alone rate. This is interesting because you can see the roadway and VMT that had the largest VMT reduction. Of course, you'd expect also have a big change in drive alone, but you also see the cordon and the parking, especially parking B, that has the highest parking rates. Those are tolling mechanisms that impact employment areas. Obviously, the higher we saw from the parking map, the higher charged parking is where there's a lot of employment, and the cordons impact downtown Portland where there's a lot of employment. And those are places with great transit or better transit access than most places. So it's easy to change the drive alone rate with those types of costs. These aren't huge numbers. Most of the scenarios overall are decreased between 0.5 and 1%, but it is interesting to see that phenomenon with the parking and cordon. Next. So jobs accessible by auto. This is how many jobs you can get to within 30 minutes by auto, by TAZ. And so again, you'd expect the VMT scenarios and the roadway scenarios with their, the largest change in volumes to have the biggest increase because the travel times improve for those on the freeways for the roadway and VMTC with just fewer cars on the roads. The cordon actually causes a decrease in jobs accessible by auto, and that's impacting the trips. That's because of that diversion we saw from the arterials from downtown to the arterials around downtown, and especially on I-5 and I-405. So this impacts the jobs accessible really across downtown. Like if you live on the east side, the jobs on the west side are now less accessible because of the increased traffic, increased volumes on I-405 and I-5. Next, so jobs accessible by transit. This is within 45 minutes of transit. And in this one, the roadway is the one that you actually see a decrease in the jobs accessible. And in that one, if you remember the volume map, we saw the diversion from the freeways to the arterials. Well, the buses run on the arterials and not so much on the freeway. So the added volumes on the roadway and the slower travel times impacts the transit operations for the roadway scenarios. These are not big changes, sorry, not as big as the other, as by auto. I mean, we're looking at 2.5% and 1% decrease for the worst roadway. Next one. So this is an attempt to look at both the jobs accessibility by auto and the cost. So these bivariate maps include those two data points, and the costs is when we're talking about costs, we're talking about kind of a regional cost. So it includes the operating cost of all the cars. It includes the tolls paid. It also includes the transit fares paid to try to capture those people who changed modes. And what am I missing? Parking costs as well. So for this example, this is the roadway A. You can see that dark purple color is where people have the best combination of higher jobs access and lower costs.
Matt, it's actually the light blue.
Sorry. The light blue has the higher job access and the lower cost. So, but the blue is where we have the better jobs access. And you can see that generally happens along the freeways like 26 and 405 and I-5 and the lower part of 205. So those are places where the jobs access is really improved by the faster travel on the freeways. The other interesting thing is you don't see that much benefit on 84 east of downtown and on the northern part of 205. And that's because those areas have really good jobs access without using the freeway. So improving the freeway travel time, but having that diversion where you're impacting the travel time on arterials, it becomes a wash or even a disbenefit for jobs accessibility. And then the other interesting thing with this one is you see some of the places that have lower jobs access but higher cost tend to be further out. And this is a phenomenon we also saw with the, I didn't put the map in here, but with the VMT scenarios, especially where, the nice thing about the VMT scenarios is that it impacts every single trip. However, that impacts people who don't have those, who live further out more. People who live further out from job centers, they need to drive farther. They have fewer alternatives to driving. So they see more costs without as much opportunity to avoid those costs. So those are the types of things. I think these maps are interesting when you start thinking about what kind of mitigations you would need if you were to implement a program. So I think that might be, is that my last slide, Alex? Yes.
It looks like it.
We're going to talk about, Alex is going to talk about some of the costs that instead of looking at the regional look, we're going to look at some specific examples.
Yeah, and in the interest of time, I see we're getting close to the end of our presentation time. I'm just going to show.
Yeah, I was going to say
one
maybe a
example.
5-minute warning or something.
Yeah. So I'm just going to show one of the few examples that we had pulled up, but the others in the presentation if that's shared afterward. So this is actually Peter Bosa's brainchild. I think he's on the call, of a way to help illustrate with fictional characters how individuals could be affected by these different scenarios. So we looked at how travel times would change and how their auto costs would change. And so in this example, Sally, she lives in Oregon City and she drives to work on Swan Island. And what you can see in the table is that in every different scenario for this trip, Sally sees an improvement in travel time. And in some of them, she sees an improvement in increase in total auto costs. But for some of them, she doesn't pay any more, but she still gets benefit. The interesting thing I found was that it was almost a 1-to-1 ratio of $1 spent and 1 minute saved in travel time. So you can see the more that she spends in these different scenarios, the more travel time she's saving. But some of these scenarios actually get pretty pricey, the cordon B and the 2 roadway scenarios. So we also wanted to look at what if Sally didn't want to pay those costs? What if she wanted to avoid the tolls? And so we calculated that and we found that she can avoid most of the charge, but she loses all of her benefit in travel time and actually ends up spending more time commuting than she did before if these scenarios were run and she avoided the toll. So there's a couple more examples of that. We have a bunch more that we're going to include in our final report, but we are running low on time. Kyle, did you want to say something again really quick? Sorry, you unmuted.
Oh, there I am off mute. Okay, yeah. Let's see, are you?
I've got 3 more slides, I think.
Oh, you have 3 more, okay. All right.
Yeah, so almost done.
We've got some questions piling up here in the chat.
Awesome. I'll go fast then. Just really quickly to say, we did bring in a group of experts, not modeling experts, but experts in the field of congestion pricing who have worked to implement projects in other parts of the country and around the world to review our methods and technical findings and share insights that they've gained from their work. It was on April 22nd. It was 2.5-hour panel, a great discussion and a question and answer session at the end of it. If anyone's interested in watching that, it was actually really interesting. I will share a link to the recording in the chat after we're all done here. This is just the panelists that we had. It was a great cross section from around the country and different elements of congestion pricing. Generally speaking, the panel did agree with the methods that Metro was using to evaluate congestion pricing, and they thought that the findings we were seeing that Matt was just presenting were not really all that surprising from what they've seen in their work. They did tell us that we should really focus on identifying the problems that we're trying to fix and hone in congestion pricing on dealing with those and not worry necessarily about just raising revenue or trying to fix everything. They also highlighted that we really need to build equity into the start for pricing projects and conduct detailed analysis to see where the benefits and impacts occur and to whom. We've started doing that a little bit with the bivariate map and some other research that we've done that Matt showed, but there's more to be done. And they also, interestingly, found that public support in other projects has changed over time. Early on, people hear about the benefits and there's moderate support. But right before implementation, they start to worry about the costs that they're going to pay. So support plummets, and it's very low. But after implementation, people see the benefits of the project, even with the costs that they're paying, and support bounces back and goes to a moderate high level. So last slide, we've done a lot of work, a lot of modeling. We're incorporating feedback from the expert panel, the Metro Council, and JPACT, and combining the findings that Matt was just sharing with additional information on equity and implementation considerations. That's all going to go into a big final report coming out this summer. It talks about how well the different tools perform in our region, if there's areas of concern that should be studied further, which we think there are, and considerations for policymakers and projects that are going forward. And that's it. There's a lot of information, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat and we can answer some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you too. Appreciate it. Lots of good work, and the comment about public support around the tolling I thought was very appropriate. As we do start to look at congestion pricing in this area, not only with this study but with some studies going on. It's important. It's important that the first one out of the gate, frankly, gets it right, because you'll set the perception, I think, for any other congestion pricing project that comes downstream from that. So getting it right the first time is going to be of paramount importance. So I'm glad to see that there's been some comments around that. So let's jump right into the questions here. There's a few of them. I think maybe I will read these two, since they're, in some cases addressed to both of you. How about I read them and then I'll let you two kind of decide which one can answer.
Sounds great.
This is from Li Ming. Alex and Matt, can you explain why there are increases in delay and roadway scenarios? I would expect people to drive less when the cost of driving increases. Just a reaction, I guess, around that question.
Is this referring to the volume maps, or we had VMT? And well, anyway, you have some, so on the roadway, you have faster travel on the freeways because you're removing volume from that. Because of the charge. So some people are avoiding that, the freeway, and shifting their trip to the arterials. So the arterials are seeing more volumes and more congestion. Our maps weren't showing congestion, they're just showing increased volumes, but you can assume, and we saw in some other data, that we do have some places where there is delay and there is more congestion. So for the roadway, it's because of diversion from the freeways to the arterials. And for the coordinates, a similar story, people avoiding driving through downtown by using avoiding driving on arterials downtown and avoiding that toll, but now shifting onto the freeways around downtown. So that causes congestion on I-5 and I-405.
And I'd add that we did see mode shift and reductions in volumes in both those scenarios. But for the cordon, there's the only people who have to pay are the people who end in downtown and choose to drive. So anyone who used to cut through downtown, like Matt was saying, they're just increasing volumes on the other routes that avoid the cordon. So you can actually get some of both.
All right. Let's see, moving along here, Tara with ODOT. On the pricing project, did you account for shifts outside of the region with high prices, say Vancouver or the rest of the state?
No, we were.
I guess by shifts, she means traffic volumes outside of the region, yeah.
No, we were just looking at our MPA. So we didn't look at outside the MPA. Yeah. Well, we did some runs where we did, but we, knowing that we are likely would only be able to implement tolling within the MPA, that's where we focused our analysis.
Okay. Becky, also from ODOT. did you run a VMT scenario with larger fleet proportion of electrics or hybrids?
We did not.
If so, did you report the impact on emissions? Yeah, okay.
No,
So that
all
would
I
be
looked at was the change in price.
yeah. So you didn't look at obviously changing fleet mix or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, we don't typically do that in our model right now, and I know you guys use this. So Alex from ODOT, the peer review I thought was overly critical and not very experienced in VMT charges. To me, VMT seems like the clear winner. I'm just curious for any Metro perspective on that post-peer review discussion.
I'd say VMT, just from a volume reduction perspective, at a regional level, is a clear winner, but it's pretty indiscriminate in how it tries to solve the problem. So it depends on what your problem is that you're trying to solve. If you're just trying to reduce the volumes generally across the region, it definitely shows some promise. But if you're looking to target specific corridors or parts of the region, the other scenarios may have advantages. But I don't think as a Metro team, I don't think we've discounted any of the scenarios and said that they're infeasible or not worth pursuing any further.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. As I recall, some of the highest transit shifting, mode shifting within the scenarios, I believe, is around one or two of the parking scenarios, if I recall correctly. And so I thought that was, well, on a couple different levels, I thought it was interesting just to be able to show the sensitivity of people's decisions and trade-offs around time versus cost, right? If you're charging a higher parking cost, say downtown by an employment center, like Matt mentioned, and people now choose instead of driving to get on transit, you would assume that that's probably a higher trip time or a higher travel time now. And so being able to kind of show that sensitivity of where exactly people are willing to trade off their time in response to costs, I thought was interesting and made for a very interesting scenario. So anyways, that was one of the scenarios that I thought was interesting. I don't know if I'd call it a winner per se, but I thought it was pretty cool to see and to quantify. Josh Roll.
Can I jump in there real quick?
Oh, yeah,
about the
sure.
the VMT scenario? I mean, like Alex said, it had really good results. It also it's not a big charge per person because it's charged to everybody every driving trip. So some of the other ones, it's a pretty, like the parking is a pretty big cost to pay for the few people. It's like a few people are bearing the brunt of it. So that's one nice thing about the VMT. On the other hand, like I mentioned before, I think you have to be concerned for people who don't have options other than driving and need to drive a long way, and pretty much in the rural area. So that's one of the drawbacks of that one. You don't have a choice. The other scenarios, you have a choice to not pay the toll. Okay, sorry. Go on, Kyle.
Yeah, Josh Roll from ODOT. It would be ideal to also consider safety outcomes by looking at the VMT changes by roadway functional class. Digging into the aggregate VMT reduction, some scenarios showing increases on certain corridors due to diversion. Can you split the VMT changes out by functional classification? Less VMT on interstates, but more on arterials, and potentially diversion from arterials to local streets. Could shift costs from freeway travelers to residents in neighborhoods under some scenarios. The cost change from delay for freeway users to safety issues for residents. Yeah, so that diversion to local facilities and increase in VMT and what that means to potentially safety outcomes. you guys have a reaction around that.
Yeah, and our study, sorry, Matt, our study didn't have an opportunity to really get into the safety ramifications of that. But one of our considerations that we're going to put forward is that that's something that should be looked at, particularly in terms of reinvestment of revenues, areas where we might be negatively impacting safety, and what we can do to mitigate that, whether that's new crosswalks, wider sidewalks, whatever the case may be. Those are areas that we'd want to look to reinvest that revenue to improve safety. Do you have something to add, Matt?
Oh,
No, I mean, that's something we could do and we didn't do. There are lots of things we could do that were just limited by time. So that's safety is one we kind of punted on as far as the model is concerned.
let's see. I believe there's like 3 more. We have 2 minutes. So why don't we send these out, Matt, to you and Alex, and maybe you guys could follow up. I'll have Carol get a hold of you two with these questions, and maybe you guys can just put some language to them, and we'll send them back out to the group. How does that sound? Just in the interest of time. Carol, does that sound like something that might work?
We can certainly do that if Matt and Alex have time to respond to them that way.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's fine.
Take it as a good sign. Lots of interest in your work. I knew this would be a good topic, and thank you guys so much for presenting today. And hopefully we can get you back and give us an update on this work, or potentially some work in the future that you guys are doing. The investment group, investment corridor group is always kind of leading the region and looking at new corridors to study, and it's always interesting, some of the tools and analysis that you guys do, and I think pertinent to bring back to this group. So again, thank you very much. And with that, I think we'll move to our final presenter, Lisa Zorn from MTC in the Bay Area. She is going to give us a bit of a presentation around cost benefit analysis, something that's new to this region as well, and how they're using it for the San Francisco Bay Area long range transportation plan. So Lisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Oregon, virtually. And if you could take a minute or two and just kind of let us know who you are, what you do, and then feel free to launch in. Again, for folks that may have joined here recently onto the call, please save your questions for Lisa at the end, or put them in the chat box and we can address them at that time. So Lisa, I'm going to hand it over your way now. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Good morning. Or yes, it's still morning. I was going to say. As by way of a little bit of introduction, I started my career in computer science, and I was a software engineer in Silicon Valley for a little while. And then I decided to do a career switch, and I started learning about planning, and I went to planning school, and then I found, well, hello, there's modeling, which is kind of both computer science and planning together in one perfect combination. So I became a modeler, I don't know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And my first job was at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So I started with travel modeling there. When I came to MTC, I was doing travel modeling for a while, and now I manage the forecasting, modeling, and surveys team. So that includes the regional economic modeling process and the land use modeling process and travel modeling process, as well as the survey work that informs all of the above. So with that, I will share.
We could probably give you a whole agenda yourself to cover everything you do down there. but
I'm still learning more and more about the regional economic modeling and the land use forecasting side. So I would say I'm still more of a travel modeler than the others, but it's
all
been
right.
fun.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here. These are your people then.
Yes. Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of expertise in this group. With that, I will talk about our, we call it our project performance assessment. And hold on, I'm scrolling around with my screen to get my stuff situated here. So you can see this PowerPoint, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. So, so we call this project performance. It's one phase of the Horizon Plan Bay Area 2050 planning process, which we are aiming for plan adoption this year. That's a 2021 plan. So this work is, this project performance assessment was one phase that we did in 2019 or so. It was done in 2018, 2019. And it was primarily actually led by Anoop Tapase, who's presented on this project performance assessment here to the November Planning Committee. And so that's sort of setting the context. And the purpose of the project performance assessment was to understand how major transportation investments would fare in an uncertain future. And this is new to this particular regional plan. The last regional plan, we also did a project performance assessment, but in this one we expanded it and combined it with futures planning, which was the previous phase, even before project performance assessment, where we sort of explored 3 what-if scenarios around, there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of the federal, what's going on, federal government framework, taxing, climate, all that stuff. And we wanted to make sure that we included some more concrete uncertainty analysis in our project performance assessment. So that's kind of what, there's a lot of discussion here about the different conditions. We analyze this in the 3 futures. And so for every single project, we analyze their benefits and costs in the 3 futures. And it was very collaborative. As you can imagine, a project performance situation has a lot of stakeholders, and they are very invested in the outcomes of this. So there was a lot of discussion. The projects came from a number of sponsors, which were other agencies. And also there were projects that could be submitted by the public. So we evaluated 12 projects that were submitted from NGOs and the public, and not just from agency partners. So this was kind of the timeline. And I'll go through these fast. These slides are actually from Anoop's presentation to the committee, and then I've inserted some more modeling specific slides in here. So that's why they're so glossy and pretty. I didn't make these. So yes, okay, next slide. This slide just goes to show that there's a bunch of things that we did, a lot of projects that we did not evaluate because they were already included in the committed baseline. And these are probably more interesting to Bay Area folks, so I won't go through that in detail, but there was a committed baseline that had a bunch of projects included already. And then this is getting more into what we did as far as the project performance benefit cost assessment. So obviously we were trying to assess for each future, was a project cost effective and resilient in terms of the benefit cost. There was an equity assessment that was really important, and that was new in this plan. We didn't do that in the previous plan, and that was based on assessing the accessibility improvements. And we measured accessibility improvements via log sums, and there we have a TRB paper that we did in the previous plan, but in this plan we looked at the log sums by income group specifically to give projects an equity score. So if greater than 60% of the project accessibility benefits went to lower income households, then we said that it advances equity. And we also had if benefits were evenly distributed, then it was even. If benefits were skewed towards higher income groups, then we noted that the project challenged equity. And then finally, there was a lot of stakeholder discussion, and we had to add sort of, well, we didn't have to, but we added a qualitative assessment so that you could, so projects could be flagged for, not being aligned with Plan Bay Area 2050's vision or guiding principles. And so that was kind of to get at the fact that there's a lot of stuff that's not modelable. And then this is a little bit more detail on the benefit cost assessment. As I mentioned already, there were the accessibility benefits through the log sums. And we did that because, the log sums, the destination choice log sums really get at all of the attributes that go into the utility of a model. And so we wanted to be able to capture all of those things and not just cost or travel time or, certain individual things. There were some items that didn't factor into the accessibility. So we also calculated the benefits from those, and those are listed here. I don't know if I have more. If you have more questions on that, we can talk about it. And then this is sort of, I think this is helpful because this is sort of the disclaimer slide where we like to make sure we are completely aware that models have limitations and that we're not trying to say we know everything because we have these models. And we look at other things too. And but the models are a good tool to analyze a lot of this stuff. So, and I'm going to talk about the modeling. This is my slide here. This is the modeling slide. And actually, here we go. I skipped this one, I think. Just to give a little bit of context about those 3 what if futures. These are the 3 what if futures that we used for the project performance assessment. So rising tides, falling fortunes was kind of more similar to today's climate, or today's just sort of more of a straight line forecast, although not exactly. I'll note that all of these did have different total regional control sort of growth forecasts. So we tried to make them pretty different. These what if scenarios came out of a collaborative stakeholder process. So we didn't just make these up. There were workshops and things like that, where a bunch of folks in the Bay Area who worked at, who are in different agencies came together and put together these 3 futures. And then we tried to model them as well as we could. Clean and green is sort of a future where there's a lot of AV, EV penetration. It's kind of more, science fiction, maybe sort of utopia, unless you really love driving, I suppose, because it's more expensive to drive, more urban housing preferences. And then back to the future is the high growth scenario, dispersed housing, more urban jobs, also high EV, AV penetration, inexpensive driving. So I guess I shouldn't have said rising tides, falling fortunes was the closest to today. It was only closest today in sort of some things, but I think it's also a little bit of a negative thing where reduced regulations makes it more, we're more vulnerable to climate change. So none of them were really not today. None of them were really sort of in the middle exactly, because the whole point was that we were trying to make them divergent. So back to this. Okay, so the modeling framework, basically, we have the regional forecasts, and then, as I said, it's for each of the futures, 3 futures. So we tried to integrate, all these external forces, which include attributes like different immigration levels, the AV, EV penetration, sharing preferences in terms of how willing people are to share spaces and they're traveling, how willing they are to use pooled rides or transit, versus how much they're like, stay away from me. I think, unfortunately, we did all this work and we didn't think about something like a pandemic, but you can see how that would definitely possibly change some of these external forces. So we have the regional forecast, which we did for each of the futures. And then we fed that into Bay Area Urban Sim, our small area land use model for each of the 3 futures. And then we constructed a future baseline for each of the 3 futures. And then for each of those, we ran through our project definitions. So around 100 projects. So we basically, we ended up doing around 300 model runs. And then both the baseline and the with project results were compared, and the differences were compiled into project benefits, and then the project costs fed into that as well to create the project benefit cost ratios for each project. So it was a lot of work. And this is an example, I just put this screenshot up here where in our, we automated like everything. And one, this is actually, this is our Cobra worksheet, which I kind of put this snake in here as a joke. In the first round of project performance assessment, which is in the previous cycle, and it's stayed ever since. And that's the cost benefit results analyzer. But every time we did a run, this would come out of it automatically. And this wasn't used, this was the workbook version was more used by planners to sort of understand and really dig into the results of what was driving these things. And it evolved over time. And the Anoop, added, instrumented this quite a bit in terms of adding more complicated benefit cost sort of monetary calculations in here. But this was sort of our debug tool. And then we also had a sort of CSV. I'm figuring modelers might care about this stuff, so I'm giving a little bit of the technical detail. But we also added, basically the way that it would do it is it would spit out these Excel, and that was more for debugging, and then it would also spit out CSV type outputs as well that we would roll up into Tableau, so you could see sort of all the 3 futures and all the projects in one sort of roll up, and then most of that was done in Tableau. So some modeling highlights and challenges to handle the complexity of this coding, the network coding. We used our Python-based tool, Network Wrangler. This is for those who know about Network Wrangler. There's a Network Wrangler 2 that we're moving to, and this is kind of the first version of it that I also used and helped to develop when I was at San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So I brought that along with me, and that's basically coding each project in a series of scripts and input files so that you can just run a script and it'll say, take this baseline, apply this project, spit out the new network. And so then each project was coded that way, and you could sort of easily add it to any baseline and move it forward. And the other thing is, as we were coding these 100 projects and having to put them in the 3 different baselines, a lot of times we would find a problem with the baseline. That's pretty typical, where we would realize we had to fix the baseline. So we would iterate on the baseline too, but not as frequently. I think at the end we were on baseline 16 for each of the 3 futures. So it was more than 300 runs. It was a lot of work in the retrospect. Each model run took about 12 to 24 hours. We didn't do any simplified short version of the model run because in the previous plan, we had tried that and found that to be too error prone and not really worth it. So instead we worked with Cube to get an Amazon image, and we were able to run it on Amazon, so we could run, I think at our peak, we had maybe 30 Amazon servers that we would just be churning these model runs through. And we had so many that we had to do that Anoop, who is our planner running this project, instead of him having to wait for modelers, the human resource was also a real issue in this. He would actually we were like, if you want to run the model and it's ready to go and someone's QA'd the inputs, you can just run it yourself. And here's how you log into Amazon, and here's how you run it. And so he was running them too. And so that was really, really awesome. So there was a lot of really close collaboration with the non-modeling staff. And then the other thing that I thought was an interesting aspect is the sea level rise was included in the futures. So the three different futures had different levels of sea level rise. But when we got to sort of running the project performance assessment with the sea level rise included, we realized it was having such a strong effect on the projects. And it was basically like this was an issue of the resilience project interfering or having, having an out, whether or not you included resilience projects has an outside effect on the benefits or costs of the projects that are, affected at all by sea level rises, including all the land use effects. And so, so fairly early in the process, we changed course on that and realized that we had to sort of not deal with the sea level rise changes on the land use and the networks for project performance because it was making too big of an effect. And so we did pull that. And then to the findings, I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because they're probably more interesting to Bay Area folks. But when we did release the findings, it was a contentious process because everybody cares about their projects. But we did find that, a lot of projects had different scores in the different futures. And to Alex's point about the combination of projects, which I just saw in the chat, that definitely came up, and it was sort of something that was discussed in the findings that like there were a lot of projects which would make sense with other projects. And so I think, and there were also projects where some of the findings in terms of the issues that were affecting the project or making its benefit worse could be, mitigated by another project or doing additional action. So there was a lot of discussion like that, and the discussion was really robust afterwards. So, but the overall lower cost transit improvements, not terribly surprisingly, were a win. The sea level rise protections were a big win. There were, the high cost rail projects tended to have worse equity outcomes and tended to be very more successful in the sort of high growth futures. And so you could see that there was some risk associated with them. And some projects have synergies while other projects compete with each other. And then we did, of course, look at pricing strategies, and we did look at them sort of relevant to the previous presentation. We looked at them with discounts, toll discounts, because the equity issue was such a big deal. Transit fare reforms, we did some modeling of that, although it's a tough one to model because there's a lot of, I think, aspects of that we don't model in terms of, we don't have good studies or data to indicate sort of what the psychological impact of having a much simplified transit fare structure are. So it's more just the monetary value of a different fare structure. And micromobility, that one was trickier to model also. I could talk about that in a little bit more detail, but because the travel model 1.5 doesn't really capture micromobility that well. So I think for some of the projects were, not modelable, and we had to do analysis outside of it. And then this is kind of how the presentation of the final assessment findings were in terms of there was a benefit cost ratio with the red, yellow, and green scale, and then the equity score, which is challenges, even, or advances. And then I think I'll close it there.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. That's a lot to digest. That's great work.
There's a lot
For
to,
sure.
I think I just threw it out at you, but.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's, like drinking from a fire hydrant, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we, in the metro region up here in Portland, we have developed a benefit cost tool as well, although the implementation is in, I would call it infancy stage, not quite yet up to where you guys are at. I'm wondering, and I'll address the chat questions in a minute, but since I'm moderator, I get to ask my questions first. I'm assuming that this then gets moved, these scoring, I guess, the scoring of projects gets moved to ultimate designation in the RTP. Is that kind of where these projects are headed?
Yes. So yes, exactly. That's exactly what happens. So,
And
that has been done already. So
it
I don't
has,
think
okay.
that it was as straightforward as like any threshold or cutoff or anything like that. I think it was more a series of conversations that that the planners had with the stakeholders and so forth.
Yeah.
And they whittled down the project list to a set of projects that we modeled in the RTP.
Now, as you mentioned, I can only imagine how contentious some of those outcomes may have been. Was there a process by which an agency that may have submitted a project could go back and redesign it to try and get a better ratio, one that aligns maybe favorably for getting approved? Or I'm wondering if
Right.
process had happened or was allowed, I guess.
Right. I would say we had to push back on that from a workload standpoint, because if we were too generous about that, then I think everyone would just be like, well, how about you try this and how about you try that, and then we would never be done. So I think there was a lot of discussion up front when they were submitting their project scope to really figure that out as much as possible. And then I think in terms of redoing projects it was more of a question of like, if we had missed something and we talked to them and we had missed something in the modeling, then we would investigate that. And so we did have sort of this tail end of modeling where there were a few things that we had to keep kind of going over. But it wasn't, we definitely were we pushed back pretty hard on doing that.
Yeah.
A lot, because it was already so much work.
Yeah, that's an infinite loop. I mean, for as long as you say the model runs took, I mean, the outreach must have been even more so, right?
Right, absolutely. And I wasn't even, I mean, luckily for the modelers, we didn't get sort of pulled into those conversations with the sort of pushing back about, I mean, basically everyone who didn't get the score they were hoping for was gonna challenge us, and then we would have to.
Right.
I think our planners had to, especially a new peeler, he basically became a travel modeler through this process because he had to explain so much detail, and he coded projects and he ran the model, and so. And I think that level of like digging in was really necessary. And he dug into a lot of results. Like we would look at accessibility maps constantly and try to figure out, does this thing make sense, or is this an artifact of a modeling problem, or is this, something that we should, and there were things that were artifacts of modeling problems occasionally that we would have to sort of negate. So it wasn't a legitimate issue.
On the top, this will be my last question for now. And then if you could leave your contact information in the chat, because I'd like
Absolutely.
I'd like to follow up with you on some other topics related to this as well. But my last question is around those log sums that you mentioned and the accessibility. I'm wondering, since you decided to go with the destination choice log sums, I'm wondering what other accessibility measures you were entertaining to use besides the log sums. And maybe if you could just talk briefly about how you're monetizing the log sums as well.
Right. So I think initially we had looked more at travel time and travel cost, but and we wrote a paper, a TRB paper, during the previous RTP about using log sums as our accessibility measure for project performance assessment and why we did that. So there's a lot of information there about sort of why we tended to go this way. But I mean, I would say that, you know, the models and the mode choice models have so many aspects in them, so many elements in them that are not just travel time and travel cost. And we were finding that you would get sort of, if you focus too much on travel time or travel costs, you would get sort of these counterintuitive results where you could add transit and somebody might take it and it's a lot slower. And so so if you're looking at travel time, they're losing, but they made that choice because their utility is higher, because they don't just care about travel time, they care about all kinds of things. And so we would get counterintuitive results if we use something else. And we were like, well, people are making these choices to switch because they're gaining something, and those gains are represented in the utility. And so if we use something that doesn't capture all the aspects, all the items in the utility, then we come up with weird results, and that was just not working out for us.
Yeah,
so
that makes a lot of sense. The challenge here has been around just describing log sums to the a person, right? Travel time's easy, 30 minutes on transit, or
right.
Certain threshold of time or cost, and I think that's easy for people to put their arms around and understand.
And we did have some public meetings where people sort of jokingly mocked us if we ever used the word log sum. So we try not to use the word log sum, and we would say something like an accessibility measure that encapsulates all these different things, and then sort of list them. And so that was definitely some terminology that we had to work a lot to explain.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. And it looks like maybe you added some gradations to that accessibility too, which I thought was helpful too. If you had greater than 60% accessibility, you fell in this category. I think that was maybe a good way to move out of the log sum nomenclature and more into the accessibility and kind of scale it relatively to each other. I thought that was helpful as well. All right, let me move to, in the interest of time here, let me move to a few of the questions. I need to scroll up here. Okay, I think you addressed Alex's question about modeling separately. So Ray Jackson from Mid-Willamette Valley COG, which is down in Salem, Oregon, just to give you geographic context here, Lisa. Ray asks, in the benefits and cost slide, it showed that rehab of a project was included. Can you elaborate on how that was estimated, I guess, cost-wise?
Rehab. Let me take a look which project. I think the rehab project was around sort of this, I'm guessing that you're talking about, there's this project that's like a roadway segment that's really important, but it gets flooded all the time. So it's kind of been like not reliable. So that's a good question. I'm not sure about the details of that exactly, other than I think that we modeled the link as sort of not being there and being there, as rehab, and then maybe that was I'm not entirely sure. So I'm guessing, because it was both a while ago, and also the detail of individual projects was like much more in Anoop's world and much less in my world. But there were some things where the modeling was less straightforward, and so maybe there was scaling of the results. Like I know we had difficulty with projects that benefited users outside of the region, because, you know, in our travel modeling, we're not really representing those people as simulated individuals. And so, so I think for things like that, there was some scaling, maybe 1.5 times the benefit or something like that, based on sort of stakeholder discussion. And so I think for the rehab type of project, it might have been something along those lines, although I can't totally be sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So I no promises. I might be wrong, but I think that might have been what took place.
All right. All right. Let's.
Get more information if you really want to know, though.
Ray, are you there? I mean, do you want to jump in? Is that suffice, or do you want to?
I guess the question was the slide was for cost and benefits, and it seemed like it was implying that as a cost, you were somehow including the rehab or the reconstruction of a project within the time frame of the plan. And I was just,
Oh, I see. You're talking about the cost.
yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. That's different. So the cost projection over time, I believe they did try to incorporate a pretty robust projection of costs to maintain the facility over time, which in some cases would include, you know, higher maintenance costs than other projects, depending on what the project was. So I think they did a pretty in-depth look at the assets and what it costs to keep that you know, asset in state of good repair throughout the life of the study period. And that was done outside of the model. So the cost stuff was like all planners, and then we just, you know, they sort of plugged it in after the fact in Tableau. So that was sort of their own input, because the modeling side was the benefits.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Next question, Alex. Really interesting to hear the findings on light rail, because there are a lot of strong backers to light rail. Can you speak to how those conversations went? For example, what was it like to discuss that light rail might be a project that benefits the rich?
I mean, I think that those were fairly contentious, and that was also sort of, I think, true for commuter rail projects as well. They also tend to have sort of challenging equity scores, but I think that those conversations were challenging, but I also think that there were a lot of people who really appreciated that we talked about that, and that we didn't just, you know, say, you know, benefits, yay. We looked more specifically at who received those benefits and how much, you know. I think the equity score overall was really appreciated by stakeholders, as a way to honestly confront those kinds of issues. So while I wasn't really directly involved in a lot of those conversations, my impression is that it was contentious, but also a lot of people appreciated it.
Were you guys able to weight the different benefits differently based on maybe the priorities of the decision-making body, or the criteria with which you scored the projects?
I think that we tried to make sure that the benefits sort of encapsulated the, you know, 5 sort of goals of the plan, but we didn't weight them outside of that, and we really weighted them based on sort of a valuation of what that benefit was, so it's translated into dollars. Yeah, and to your point earlier, you were asking about the accessibility. We did translate the log sum accessibilities into a dollar value.
Yeah.
And we did not, the dollar value was the same for all income levels, because we did not want to say that we as an agency value increased accessibility. Like we as an agency value increased accessibility for all income levels the same. regardless of what their value of time is.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And there is documentation on what those valuations are for each of the measures and where they came from. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot of very detailed methodology, because all the methodology stuff had to be decided up front before we really launched into the modeling. And so these sort of terms were negotiated early on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, anything, Lisa, that, you know, you've mentioned a couple of documents. If you could, as you think of it while we're online here, if you could just send us a quick link in the chat room,
Absolutely.
people would appreciate it. And maybe while you're doing that, I'll read off what I think is the last question for you from Tara at ODOT. Interesting to see, or interesting how we can't control sea level pricing, gas or lower operating costs with electric vehicles are more significant than we can control. Makes it important to talk about what might happen and how responses or best projects to fund might change the concept benefits of your work, resulting discussion, other insights in dealing with uncertainty. I think at this point, I'm gonna ask Tara to maybe unmute and articulate maybe a little bit more, better than I'm doing at least, some of the insights and reactions that you had from Lisa's talk. Are you there, Tara?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Lisa. Yeah, so I guess, you know, my big thing is, I think, you know, you studied 3 futures to test resilience. So what's the bottom line you found from that uncertainty? You know, I think there's a lot of sort of concept value. And so kind of wanting to contrast, you know, none of those futures is real, but there's so much we can't control, some of which you decided at one point to just drop out. And I understand that. So like, what did you leave with in terms of understanding uncertainty and how that was relayed in a conversation with the group? And is there next steps you're doing on that?
Sorry. Thank you. I am muted. So even though we did leave the sea level rise out, the auto operating costs were different. The sharing, these preferences were different. The land use was different, and the land use is probably the biggest thing. And I think you could sort of tell, and not surprisingly, that the land use affected things quite a bit, because a lot of these very expensive high capacity projects are really dependent on the land use intensity and how much that is and where it's forecast. And also, you know, the sort of modal specific parts of the sort of high operating, well, like high auto operating costs is a very, really means that there was a lot of transit crowding and a lot of transit use in that particular future. And so to me, it really was about how these projects, how much they are affected and how robust they are to those types of things, because we don't know if we're going to have a low growth future, and we don't know what auto operating cost is going to be like. And if a project really pencils out really well only in those circumstances, but not in other circumstances, I think that's interesting to know. So I think that those ended up being sort of the strongest signals, is the land use part of it and things like auto operating costs, and, you know, and that type of forecast.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tara and Lisa. Let's see, we have about 5 minutes left, and I was given 10 on the agenda, so I'm going to make them really quick. But before I leave, I want to echo what Peter wrote in the chat room, which is great presentations by everybody today. You know, this was a really great topic. I think a really good theme. Transportation and economics. It's one certainly that has a bright future to it as money becomes scarce and funding sources begin to dry up. So certainly questions around equity were a popular theme today, in addition to kind of monetizing some of the benefits, some of the actual users of projects. So really enlightening. It was nice to bring somebody in from out of the area. So I appreciate you taking the time, Lisa. I see you have left some homework for us and your email as well. So we'll have to look you up. But yeah, very productive session today. Thanks to all the speakers. I did just want to wrap up here quickly and let folks know that we're looking at next fall or this coming fall for our next Oregon Modeling Users Group meeting. The theme that the chairs have collaborated about and collaborated around will be one of COVID and travel and transportation and in our new COVID era. So look for an announcement for that meeting coming up in this September or October. If you're at this meeting today, you're on our mailing list, and so you will get a mention or an email in your inbox regarding the exact time and date of this topic. I believe Joel Friedman from RSG will be the moderator of that session, so that should be a good one as well. And in the beyond that, we're looking at another meeting in the winter to cover some topics around activity sim. So we've got a lot on the horizon, and certainly agendas are not set for any one of them now. So I guess take this as a call to for papers or presentations if any of these particular topics interest you and you've done some work around them. Please get a hold of Carol or myself and let us know your interest. But other than that, Carol, are there any final words mentioned for the good of the order today?
I don't have any, Kyle. So whenever you're ready to adjourn, we can let them loose.
All right. Well, thanks everybody again. And I saw the participation level up at one point as high as it was in the 30s. So really good showing today. You guys are doing great work. Thank you so much for being able to share this work with your peers. And hopefully everyone walks away a little bit more informed today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.